Have you ever wondered exactly how much money you have spent on pest control for your garden over the past 5 years? Do you remember how many bottles of neem oil you bought? How many bottles of insecticidal soap, spray you used? How many yellow sticky traps you hung? How much powder you scattered? How many products labeled natural and safe you tried? Have you ever experienced pests decreasing for just a few days, only to return as if nothing had happened? Have you ever felt that it was your fault, that you used the wrong product, or that the timing was off? But what if the problem wasn't your choice of products? What if what your garden lacks isn't a new product, but the right system? What if the reason you've struggled so much wasn't a lack of effort, but the initial mindset itself? And what if there are actually people who spend almost no money, yet cultivate gardens with less pest damage than yours? There was a time when I too found it slightly painful to go out into the garden. The evening soil still holds the warmth of the day. Tomato leaves sway softly in the wind. By appearances alone, it is peaceful. But crouching down and looking closely, there was a different scene. Small holes punched in the leaves, pepper seedlings with weakened tips, bite marks that seemingly weren't there moments ago. Every time I saw those small wounds, the feeling of, "Do I have to buy something again?" spread in my chest. For a long time, I thought gardening was about preparing good soil, ample water, and sunlight. However, I realized that what exhausts many people the most is not the act of growing itself, but the feeling of being chased by the same problems over and over. At first, I thought like most people. When I saw aphids, I looked for something that would act as a cure. If leaves were being eaten, I looked for something stronger, something that seemed like it would work faster. I believed that if I just found the right product, things would surely settle down. However, even as the seasons changed, the insects returned. Just when I thought things had gone quiet for a few days, they appeared as if nothing had happened. Each time a feeling heavier than the loss of money remained. It was a doubt perhaps I was heading in the wrong direction from the very beginning. What changed that mindset was a very short conversation. A few years ago near Lancaster, I had the opportunity to speak with an Amish gardener. I mentioned that I was troubled by aphids on my pepper plants and asked what they usually spray. With a very serene face, the person said, "They don't spray anything. They leave it to the ladybugs," that was all they said. Then they pointed to a strip of wildflowers stretching along the edge of the garden. It was constantly filled with the faint sound of buzzing wings. They hadn't bought and released ladybugs. They didn't have a special secret product. The reason the insects wanted to keep living there was properly established within the garden. From that moment, my perspective changed. The Amish people did not consider pest control a problem to be solved by buying something. They believed in the importance of the accumulation of things, which plants to place, where to leave flowers, where to create places for beneficial insects to take shelter, and how early and carefully one observes the garden. Interestingly, modern gardening philosophies are also approaching this. What is important is not eradicating all insects from the garden. It is preventing pests from multiplying to the point of ruining the crops. In other words, rather than reacting strongly after a problem has grown large, it is more important to create a garden from the beginning where problems are unlikely to grow large. From then on, I stopped viewing my garden as a place that was always missing one bottle of spray. I began to see it as a living space that could regulate itself if I deepened my understanding a little and changed how I placed things. And I realized something. The first line of defense was not in something lined up on a store shelf. It quietly began within a very small daily morning habit. The next morning, I started with the simplest thing I had taken lightly until then. I didn't bring a new spray. I didn't open my phone to look up what to buy. I just went out into the garden a little earlier than usual. It was a time when the sun was not yet high, and the quietness of the night still lingered a little. The garden at that hour showed me much more than I had thought. Small water droplets remained on the edges of the leaves, and the moist smell of the soil rose softly. Without the bustle of the day differences that I would usually overlook emerged. Previously, I thought of walking around the garden in the morning as just a peaceful habit for people with plenty of time. But now I know it is not just a pleasant stroll. It is the first line of defense. It is not a time to chase after pests once they have spread, but a time to step one pace ahead before they do. Looking closely, there were many things I had previously overlooked. On the undersides of the squash leaves, small copper-colored eggs were clustered quietly. On the tomatoes, a small amount of dark-colored droppings remained on the lower leaves. On the cabbage and kale leaves, there were small holes that almost looked like tears from the wind. But looking closer, they were all meaningful signs. The garden had properly informed me in advance before I was truly in trouble. It's just that I previously lacked the stillness to read them. I filled a small bucket with water, mixed in just a little dish soap, and brought it with me. It is very simple. I walk slowly from one end of the furrow to the other. I gently lift the leaves with my fingertips and check the undersides. I follow the tomato stems with my eyes from top to bottom. Near the young pepper seedlings, I crouch slightly and look for a long time. I pause again at the places that caught my attention the day before. And when I find an insect, I pick it off by hand and drop it into the water. Is something like this really helpful, my former self thought. To be honest, I can still well understand the feelings of people who think that way. But I quickly realized, what matters is not how many you catch that morning. It is not giving small numbers the time to grow into big problems unnoticed. Large caterpillars on tomatoes will eat quite a few leaves off a branch in just a short time. Stink bug families, even if they seem few, will multiply their eggs if left alone. Small green caterpillars on brassicas are also inconspicuous when they first appear. But if left unobserved for a few days, they will leave the softest leaves covered in scars first. Previously, I acted after the damage became clearly visible to the eye. By that time, I already felt as though I had been defeated by something. What I understand now is that many of the major losses in a garden do not begin with a suddenly appearing massive army. They are the result of overlooked small signs being left as they are for a long time. And there was another unexpected change. As I walked the garden like this every morning, the usual appearance of each furrow gradually entered my body. I came to know what healthy tomato leaves look like in the morning light. I came to know what color the underside of a squash leaf is when it hasn't yet been found by insects. I gradually became able to distinguish between leaves that naturally age and leaves conveying some anomaly. Once that sense is born, the garden is no longer a place of sudden, unpleasant events. It becomes a living space where understanding deepens day by day. And that understanding itself eases the exhaustion of gardening. The Amish gardener I met did not speak of this as if it were a special technique. They accepted it as something as natural as having breakfast, or opening the door at the beginning of the day. But the more you continue, the more you understand its weight. To walk the morning garden with eyes that truly observe does not mean you are just looking for insects. You are reading the flow of the entire garden. Where are good changes growing? Where is the balance beginning to collapse? Where should you just watch over things? Where should you intervene right now? Such things gradually become visible. No product can provide that kind of connection. No spray will cultivate the ability to understand your own garden. Within just a tiny habit, I was beginning to regain what I had long lacked. That was the initiative. Instead of rushing to help after the leaves were tattered, I became able to notice at a stage where it was still well within my own hands to manage. And from around that time, I felt that the garden's responses also gradually began to change. Not all insects disappeared. It's just that they no longer had the time to gain the upper hand. In the garden of a person who goes out early in the morning, crouches, looks closely, and repeats, this many problems are quietly stopped before they grow large. And after your eyes have learned to read the garden, another important thing comes into view. That is altering the arrangement of the garden itself so that pests have difficulty finding their target crops in the first place. As I walked slowly through the morning garden and became able to notice small changes, my eyes began to see something else entirely. No matter how carefully you tend to them, There are gardens that seem as if they have set a dining table for the insects. Conversely, there are gardens where the very layering of the air feels completely different the moment you enter. There isn't just one scent. Leaf shapes and heights mingle, and it looks as though something is mutually supporting something else. In such gardens, surprisingly, pests alone rarely multiplied all at once. At first, I thought it was due to the quality of the soil or the luck of the weather. But as I observed more, I realized the difference was not a coincidence. What created the difference was the arrangement of the garden itself. Previously, I planted vegetables very neatly separated. Tomatoes were grouped only with tomatoes. Brassicas were gathered in another corner. Herbs were placed in yet another location, and flowers were planted elsewhere. It looked orderly and felt easy to manage. But that orderliness was an overly clear signal for pests. For insects flying in search of their preferred crops, a garden where the same scent, the same leaves, and the same presence are gathered in one place is a location where they don't need to hesitate. Without realizing it, I had turned my garden into an easily readable map for insects. In Amish gardens, such separations are not very strong. Vegetables, flowers, and herbs breathe much closer together. Basil is right next to tomatoes. Strong scented things like dill and cilantro are placed near cabbage and kale. Marigolds gently trail along the edges of the furrows. As I watched such scenery, my way of thinking also changed. Most insects do not choose their destinations by thinking like humans do. They find crops by following scents, familiar shapes, and clues given off by leaves. Therefore, if the air in the garden is monotonous and the presence of the same crop is overwhelmingly strong, it becomes easier for them to head straight for their target. However, when the scent of basil, the greenness of dill, the personality of cilantro, the stimulation of chives, and the presence of marigolds and wildflowers begin to mix into the air, that path suddenly becomes ambiguous. I gradually changed my way of planting. I stopped grouping basil in the herb corner and put it at the base of the tomatoes. I left some dill and grew it near the brassicas. I didn't place marigolds in the distance as mere decorative flowers, but put them around the furrows and near the pathways. Although it was just a tiny difference in placement, the expression of the garden changed significantly. Rather than a place where crops were merely lined up, it became a place where each seemed to be calling out to the other. And from around that time, I began to turn my eyes to the presence of allies I would have previously overlooked. There were ladybugs resting quietly on the leaves. Slender, inconspicuous green lacewing larvae were moving slowly between the stems. There were also very tiny parasitic wasps faintly crossing through the light. Previously, I thought that if I wanted beneficial insects, I had no choice but to buy and release them. I actually did that sometimes, but most of them quickly disappeared. Now I understand the reason well. Living creatures do not stay long in places where there is no food or hiding places. If the spaces between the furrows are completely exposed with no flowers, no weeds at the edges, and no places to take shelter, like under stones or old pieces of wood, allied insects will just pass through. The Amish people do not make their gardens unnecessarily sterile. They leave a strip of small wildflowers at the edge of the garden. They let some of the dill and fennel bloom into flowers. They do not try to completely eradicate a corner with clover. To the eye, it might look just a little less than perfectly tidy. But those slight margins support the living creatures that protect the garden. After realizing that I stopped looking at small patches of grass or corners with old pieces of wood merely as places I forgot to clean up, I began to consider that these might be places where allies rest. With just that single question, the way I viewed the garden changed greatly. Eventually, my garden ceased to be a place where only I and the pests faced each other. There were vegetables for me to eat, herbs to layer scents, flowers to provide nectar, and small places for allies to hide. Quiet activities that I hadn't seen before were continuing everywhere. And when the garden started to become a place where beneficial insects wanted to live, I felt that I no longer had to carry everything on my own shoulders. From there, the garden's mechanism begins to exert even more power. However, after a while, I came to understand one more thing. Observing devising planting methods and inviting allied insects are very important. Even so, there are times during a certain season when the momentum of the insects becomes slightly stronger in specific locations. At such times, the Amish people do not rush to the store. They quietly head to the kitchen. I vividly remember the first evening I stood in the kitchen facing garlic and chili peppers. Since I started continuing my morning patrols, I became able to notice anomalies in the garden much earlier. By mixing and planting basil, dill, and flowers, an atmosphere where it is difficult for pests to find the crops was gradually created. I also became conscious of leaving places where beneficial insects are likely to stay. When things get to that point, the garden looks much calmer than before. However, within the flow of the seasons, there are still times when the momentum of insects becomes a little stronger in just one corner. Aphids might cluster on young peppers. After days of lingering humidity, the presence of caterpillars on brassica leaves might suddenly thicken. At such times, the old way of thinking easily returns. Don't I need something stronger? Do I have to buy something again? Such voices rise from deep within my chest. But the Amish people do not head to the store immediately, even in such situations. They do not jump to the idea of searching for a new product just because insects have appeared. First, they look at the entire garden. Has that spot become difficult for the wind to pass through? Are the leaves too crowded? Have too many soft new shoots emerged at once? Has it become a place with few allied insects? After observing the overall flow in that way, and only when they still feel a little help is needed, do they choose a method to gently support it with things found at home. It is not something visually flashy. It is not anything particularly difficult. They merely transform very familiar ingredients found in the kitchen into a meaningful form within the flow of the garden. I was strongly drawn to that way of thinking. For a long time, I was convinced that things that work come in pretty containers, have proper labels, and state what they are for. But what was truly important was not where I bought it, but what role I used it for. The first recipe I was taught was surprisingly simple. It uses a few cloves of garlic, 1 or 2 chili peppers, lukewarm water, and just a little liquid soap. Finely chop the garlic and chili peppers, put them in the water, and let it sit overnight. The next morning, strain it through a cloth or strainer and add just a little soap to it. Doing so helps the liquid remain on the surface of the leaves. Hearing it normally, it might just sound like kitchen wisdom and not seem like a full-fledged gardening method. However, when you correctly understand its role, the way you see it changes. This liquid is not meant to eradicate everything from the garden in one go. It is not a promise to end the problem overnight. It merely makes those leaves a slightly uncomfortable place for pests. The strong smell of garlic rises the irritation of the chili peppers, makes soft insects hesitate, and the soap keeps that effect on the leaves a little longer. For me, what was truly significant was that way of thinking. Previously, I was looking for something that would end things quickly. Now it is a little different. The goal is not to find something so strong that I no longer have to be involved. It is to add just one thin, appropriate layer to an already existing system. In a garden where there are daily morning observations, basil next to the tomatoes, dill left to flower, to attract beneficial insects, and small margins left at the edges. In such a garden, the garlic and chili liquid performs a very logical function. You don't carry everything alone. It merely tilts the flow of the garden just a tiny bit in favor of the grower. And in reality, just that slight difference is sometimes enough to prevent a small cluster of aphids from turning into a massive outbreak. I usually prepare this liquid during the quiet hours of the evening. The feeling of chopping kitchen ingredients with my own hands and preparing what I will take to the garden tomorrow morning is completely different from opening the lid of a container I bought. On one hand, there is the reflex of consumption. On the other, there is the feeling of gradually understanding what I am using and why I am using it. When I spray it the next morning, I don't think I should just scatter it widely. I direct my eyes to the undersides of the leaves and choose only the places that truly need help. I avoid the hours when the sunlight is strong. I also remember that it's better to prepare it again after a heavy rain. It takes a little more effort than my previous methods, but because of that effort, the way I face the garden has become more careful, and the tendency to overdo things recklessly has decreased. What I was most grateful for, even more than the money saved itself, was that I was no longer oscillating between two extremes. When I felt there were only two choices, doing nothing or using something strong, it was very restrictive. But in reality, there is a soft path in between. It is a path to offer just a little help without disrupting the balance of the garden too much. The Amish people knew exactly that point well. They do not try to suppress nature with ever stronger forces. They merely layer small supports one by one, making it easier for the garden to stand on its own. When that mindset becomes ingrained, even old things inside the house begin to look different. Paper cores, old sheets, thinned cloth nets no longer in use. Such things quietly catch your eye as the next form of defense. Once I understood that a garden is not protected solely by chemicals or hasty interventions, the way I looked at things around the house also changed a little. There are things I would have previously thrown away without a second thought. There are used toilet paper cores. There are old sheets with slightly frayed edges. By the window, there are thin curtains that no longer fit. There are also old nets left leaning in the corner of the shed. My former self thought of such things merely as leftovers. But after hearing how the Amish protect seedlings during their most vulnerable period, those modest items began to look like important tools that support the garden. The first thing I tried was using a paper core to surround the base of a newly planted small seedling. The method is truly simple. You just cut the core short, place it gently around the seedling, and insert it slightly into the soil so it stands. It looked so plain that I wondered what such a thing could possibly change. However, the damage this small tube prevents is unexpectedly large. Among the insects that move at night near the soil surface, there are those that quietly chew through the stems of still tender seedlings. When you go out to the garden in the morning, a seedling that was healthy just yesterday might be found collapsed, as if it has lost all its strength. The leaves are still green, but only the stem has been severed. In just one night, a seedling you've cared for over weeks can be lost. However, just having something like a paper collar at the base drastically reduces that risk. By the time the paper gradually softens and blends into the soil, the seedling's stem has also become quite sturdy and is no longer as easily damaged as it was in the beginning. The next method I tried was covering the seedlings with a light cloth. Previously, I thought that if I were to cover plants, I had to properly buy specialized materials. I believed that a neat-looking frame was necessary and that it would be meaningless unless the cloth was made for that specific purpose. But the Amish people look first at what is at hand: sheets that have grown a little thin over the years, thin curtains that have finished their role inside the house. If it is a light cloth that lets light and gentle rain pass through, that alone is helpful enough. I loosely bent simple wire to create a low bow shape over the furrow and draped the cloth over it. Doing so created a quiet space around the still small seedlings. White butterflies cannot easily land on the leaves. Small, low-flying insects also have difficulty reaching the seedlings during their most vulnerable period. This is not a method of attacking something. It is simply a method of gently closing the door only when necessary. The reason I came to like this method was because of its gentleness. It doesn't transform the entire garden at once. It doesn't treat all plants exactly the same. It just wraps the seedling you most want to protect right now only during the period it most needs protecting. When it grows larger, sets flowers, and needs insects to help pollinate, you simply remove the cloth. It is not a permanent fixture, but an aid to quietly get through that period. Through this way of thinking, I became able to understand Amish gardening work much more deeply. They do not try to perfectly control the garden all year round. They merely support what is most important at any given moment with what they have. And after learning about such physical defenses, I encountered another very interesting concept. It is the idea of not trying to completely drive pests out of the garden, but rather preparing a place they are more drawn to beforehand and directing them there. When I first heard it, I found it a little strange. I felt why bother growing something that attracts insects. But as I kept thinking about it, I came to believe there might not be a softer, smarter method than this. Instead of clashing head-on with the pest's instincts, you slightly shift the destination those instincts are heading toward. I began to frequently see nasturtiums planted on the outsides or edges of furrows. That flower is not only bright and gentle in appearance, it is also a plant that aphids naturally prefer to gather on. If they gather there first, the beans and peppers on the inside become that much less conspicuous. And what is even more interesting is that when aphids gather, there the ladybugs and green lacewing larvae already living in the garden will come. The system we've built up through the previous chapters comes together as one here. Against small pests like flea beetles, the idea of lining up radishes on the outside is the same. Insects are merely moving according to their own instincts, but their destination has already been determined to some extent by the person cultivating the garden. At that moment, I realized my garden had become a very different place from before. It was no longer just a place to buy something whenever I saw an insect. Here, there are morning patrols. There are herbs layering their scents. There are flowers and hiding places that make beneficial insects want to stay. There is a kitchen liquid used only when necessary. There are paper collars and light cloths to protect the seedlings. And now there are even decoy plants that guide danger to another location. The garden was no longer just a place to endure. It had become a place with quiet strategies. However, Amish wisdom still had one final contrivance. It was a small defense, very rustic, very handy, and one that demonstrates its power precisely on damp nights. By the time I reached that point, the way I saw my garden had already changed significantly from the early days. Standing between the furrows, I no longer felt like I was fighting an invisible enemy that might appear at any moment as I did before. I had come to feel that the garden has its own rhythm. There is a time to open, a time to close places, where I must focus my eyes, and places that will settle themselves if I just wait a little. However, there is still a troublesome opponent that causes many people to sigh. They rarely show themselves during the day. They make no conspicuous sounds. But in the morning, when you peer into the lettuce furrow or at the strawberry leaves near the ground, the edges of the leaves are unevenly chewed, and only the soft parts have been quietly lost. It is slugs and snails emerging from the darkness with their slimy bodies on damp nights or mornings after the rain. The Amish people I learned from do not make a big fuss even against such opponents. They don't treat it like a special battle. What they use is so rustic, it's almost hard to imagine in our modern lives. It is wood ash. That ash left over from a wood stove or a fire in the yard. Just by drawing a thin line of that ash around plants with soft, low-lying leaves like lettuce, cabbage, and strawberries, it becomes a boundary that slugs and snails are reluctant to cross. This is not a story of mysterious magic. It is very simple. Ash is dry, fine, and slightly alkaline. Moving across it with a moist, soft body is not a very pleasant experience for them. Therefore, many change direction and look for another path. When I first heard this, it felt almost too simple. But the more carefully I looked at the garden, the more I realized that many of the things that truly work are not necessarily complex. What makes the difference is not a massive force, but perhaps a small boundary placed in just the right spot. Of course, this method, like everything else, is not something you can just use all year round without thinking. If the soil is naturally leaning toward alkaline, it is better not to add too much ash, and if heavy rain falls, the ash's effectiveness weakens, making it necessary to reapply it. However, the very act of using just the right amount while observing the condition of the soil, observing the changes in the sky, and observing the state of the plants, well represents the Amish way. They are not searching for the strongest answer. They are quietly choosing the answer that best suits that particular situation. Looking back from this point, it becomes clear that the 6 methods were not disjointed minor tricks. They naturally overlapped within a single system. Everything begins in the morning. Going out to the garden when the air is still gentle and cool, walking slowly between the furrows, turning over the leaves, and finding small changes before problems grow large. That habit restores what is most important to a gardener, the initiative. And as your eyes develop, the arrangement of the garden also changes. Basil is next to the tomatoes. Dill and cilantro are placed near the brassicas. Marigolds line the edges of the furrows. By layering scents and shapes, it becomes difficult for pests to reach their target crops solely by instinct. Following that, there are quiet allies. There are ladybugs, green lacewing larvae, tiny parasitic wasps, and beetles that walk the ground surface at night. They are not bought and brought in. They stay there because there are flowers, there are hiding places, and there are margins that are not kept too perfectly clean. And when a little support is still needed in certain areas, the kitchen becomes the next defense. A liquid made from garlic chili peppers and a little soap does not take the place of the entire garden. It merely turns the pressured leaves into a slightly less attractive place for pests. When the seedlings are still small and at their most vulnerable, paper cores and light cloths act like doors that close only at just the right time. Furthermore, when you want to shift the destination rather than pushing back head-on nasturtiums or an outer row of radishes, guide the pest's very instincts in a direction favorable to the gardener. And on the dampest nights of the season, a thin ring of wood ash becomes the final boundary, unassuming yet reliable. What I found most profound, among what I learned from the Amish people, was not each individual technique itself. What was most profound was their stance in observing the garden. They do not try to make the garden a completely sterile place. They do not even desire for all insects to disappear. Nor do they think it is fine to just buy a new product every time a problem occurs. They know that a garden is a living world, and that in a living world there is movement, there is balance, and sometimes there is collapse, requiring the time to observe it, tidy it up a bit, and then wait. Precisely because of that perspective, there is a certain effortless calmness in their gardening work. And after I too learned that perspective, a little gardening itself became something completely different. Now, if someone were to ask me what the biggest secret is to reducing pests without spending money, I don't think I would start by mentioning a product name. I would first talk about the quiet morning garden. I would talk about how to arrange the plants. I would talk about the small flowers left at the edges of the furrows. I would talk about the corner of grass that wasn't overly mowed. I would talk about a kitchen with garlic and chili peppers. I would talk about the paper cores left on the shelf. I would talk about the thin cloth saved. I would talk about the nasturtiums blooming on the outside of the garden. And I would talk about the ring of ash that protects the roots on a morning after the rain. Because in the end, what changes a garden is not a single piece of magic. When numerous small things overlap and sufficient time passes, the garden gradually regains the power to stand on its own. Only then does a person step away from the feeling of constantly chasing after pests. And in its place, I believe they acquire a calm feeling, like living quietly alongside the garden.